everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, we host over 150 free programs, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. To find out more about the National Arts Club, you can find us at nationalartsclub.org or at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of our literary committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. In the highly acclaimed This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto, the renowned author Suketu Mehta attacks the issue of immigration head-on. Drawing on his own experience as an Indian-born teenager growing up in New York City and on years of reporting around the world, Mehta subjects the world's anti-immigrant backlash to withering scrutiny. Suketu Mehta, an associate professor of journalism at New York University, is also the author of Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Mehta appears in conversation with fellow writer Amitabha Kumar. Kumar's 2018 novel, Immigrant, Montana, was named a notable book by the New York Times and is one of this year's best books and is one of the best books of the year by the New Yorker. My apologies. He is the Helen D. Lockwood Professor of English at Vassar College. This Land is Our Land and Immigrant Montana can be purchased from our preferred independent bookseller, Books on Call, and we'll be sharing the link in the chat during the conversation. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, here are Suketu and Amitabha. Please enjoy the program.
Good evening. Hi, Suketu. Unmute.
Yes.
Good.
Oh.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And we should tell the audience that, or I should tell the audience that, in a great tradition of manifestos, there's something that is so clean and clear in the voice in which you write here that I wanted you to perhaps, if you don't mind, begin with reading a little bit, just the first two paragraphs, because we arrive at the heart of the matter right there.
One day in the 1980s, my maternal grandfather was sitting in a park in suburban London. An elderly British man came up to him and wagged a finger in his face. "Why are you here?" the man demanded. "Why are you in my country?" "Because we are the creditors," responded my grandfather, who was born in India, worked all his life in colonial Kenya, and was now retired in London. "You took all our wealth, our diamonds. Now we have come to collect. We are here," my grandfather was saying, "because you were there."
That's I mean, your grandfather had, without having attended a single post-colonial class, your grandfather had caught the essence of what is post-colonial writing. When the empire writes back, that is what we are supposed to be doing. And here there is a shout out to the post-colonial class from the local Quaker school who is attending this discussion. I wanted you to also then say a little bit about the title that you have chosen and the Woody Guthrie song on which it is based. I know the other day when Biden was being inaugurated, I texted you when J-Lo came on and you had a comment to make. What was that about and how has this song been an inspiration to you? If you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Thank you. So the title of my book is, This Land is Our Land. And it's an instantly recognizable song to certainly most Americans, but also in many other countries of the world. And so the origin of the song is during the Great Depression, an Okie named Woody Guthrie began traveling around the country, listening and gathering stories and songs. So in 1944, he recorded a song that, after the Weavers popularized it, became kind of alternative national for America. Most Americans are familiar, with the opening and closing lines, "This land is your land." But what's less known is that in some variants, uh, there are additional verses that Woody Guthrie wrote, um, which make it a protest anthem and a prophetic one at that, a song for our times. So one of these verses was handwritten by Woody Guthrie in 1940, and it goes, "Was a big high wall there that tried to stop me. A sign was painted, said private property, but on the backside, it didn't say nothing. This land was made for you and me." Another version of the song, which Pete Seeger once sang, has these two verses. "In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me? Nobody living can ever stop me. As I go walking that freedom highway, nobody living can ever make me turn back. This land was made for you and me." So with these three verses, the Guthrie song becomes not just an American alternative anthem, but a universal migrants anthem. It's wherever in the world you're coming from, wherever you're going, this song was made for you and me.
And if you have, since I imagine you have a copy there, can you turn to page 197, because you return there to the Woody Guthrie anthem in a way, and in your own words, you are once again, in a way that I like, it's striking the iron when it is hot. You offer your own words there. Could you read that paragraph that begins, "I claim the right to the United States"?
Well, if you'll indulge me, I'll actually begin with the previous paragraph.
Yes, of course.
Which talks about manifest destiny, and so I'm kind of trolling this idea of manifest destiny. It is immigrants' manifest destiny to spread out from the cities and into the red states. Quote, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to over and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government," and said John L. O'Sullivan, the 19th century journalist who urged the US to annex Texas and California and Oregon and pretty much everything else. That's where the term manifest destiny first came up. So this is me. I write, "I claim the right to the United States for myself and my children and my uncles and cousins by manifest destiny. This land is your land. This land is our land. It belongs to you and me. We're here. We're not going back. We're raising our kids here. It's our country now. We will not reassure anybody about the racist fears about our deportment. We're not letting the bastards take it back. It's our America now." So I actually wrote a version of this in an op-ed in the Washington Post called "I'm an uppity immigrant. Don't expect me to be grateful." And I got no end of hate mail and death threats. There's a white supremacist organization called We Dare, which had me as its poster child for months and months. And I'd get all these, Twitter threats. There were twice people actually came to my NYU apartment building looking for me. This really pissed them off. The idea that we as immigrants, we're not going to apologize for being here. We're not going to say, "Oh, thank you so much for letting us," that we claim the right to the United States, just as previous generations of settlers claimed the right to the US. This idea of manifest destiny isn't just made for white people overrunning the Native Americans. It's also for people like us coming in, not in boats across the Atlantic, but in 747s across and into JFK.
That, in fact, is one of the best parts of the book, how you're utterly unapologetic about who you are, which is a feeling I must confess is a little bit alien to me because I always seem as if I have to apologize. So I took this like, I wanted to inject it like COVID vaccine into my veins right away. Uh, one thing you mentioned, I would like to the audience to get a sense of your own past. One of the things you mentioned early on in the book is that everything nasty that Donald Trump said or was saying about immigrants, you had already heard it in your own school when you came here. Can you talk a little bit about your background and your own experience as an immigrant?
Sure. So I came to the United States, specifically a place called Jackson Heights in Queens, which has a good claim to being the most diverse neighborhood in the country. And for anyone who's interested, I did a walking tour with the New York Times architecture critic Michael Kimmelman around Jackson Heights. This came out, I believe, last August or September in the Times. Um, and so when I got to Jackson Heights in 1977, my parents put me in the nearest, what in India would be called a convent school, that is a Christian school, a Catholic school, where I was pretty much the first minority in this all boys, extravagantly racist Catholic school in working class Queens. And these were people of the white working class. And I was a representative of everything that their parents were fearing. So I was basically meat thrown to the lions. And, those weren't the days of microaggressions, those were the days of macroaggressions. I learned to run very fast. The teachers called me a pagan. It, it was a really tough school. You can imagine, anyone who's read Tom Brown's School Days or it wasn't a boarding school, but I was keenly aware every day I went to the school I was disliked. On the second day that I entered the school, I was fresh off the plane from Bombay, and I was sitting there eating my lunch, and this boy with red hair comes up to my table and says, "Lincoln should have never let him off the plantations." And I said, "But what's that got to do with me?" I was just the other. And that experience really made me a writer. So after that school, I went on to NYU, and then I stayed on in New York. And every year, I found myself more and more at home in America. And I'd go abroad, and then when my plane would come to New York and I'd see the Rockaways looming up, I'd feel this sense of gladness of coming home. Until 2016, when the boys from my high school basically grew up and took over control of the country. And it's no accident that Donald Trump was also, like me, a Queens boy. In fact, the boys in my high school could have been his children. And it was the same sort of thing. Donald Trump grew up in a luxury enclave of Queens called Jamaica Estates. And then too, after the 1965 Immigration Act, all these Manhattan. Trump's childhood home, Jamaica Estates, I am glad to report now, is swarming with Bangladeshis and Jamaicans. The school that I went to, the almost all-white school, is also now filled with South Asians and Latinos. Basically, we overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. So it's that experience which really shaped me. And, that's why the book, I felt this need to write this book now, because it deals with this incredible hatred of immigrants, not just in the US, but globally.
Yes, yes. Now, you drew a parallel between yourself and Trump, however divergent or parallel they were in the area of Queens. But you also tell a story here about his grandfather. And you say that you're talking about the 1800s. Maybe you can talk about, if you turn to page 109, you're talking about the 1800s. Climate change caused a series of disastrous crop failures in southwestern Germany. Do you have that line in front of you?
Yes.
Could you read the next 2-3 lines, if you don't mind?
Yes. Climate migration is not new. It's happened throughout history. People have followed their families to greener pastures. In the 1800s, climate change caused a series of disastrous crop failures in southwestern Germany. A year of extreme cold would be followed by one of extreme heat. Barley, rye, and oats withered in the fields. 5 million Bavarians decided they'd had enough and got on ships to America. Among them was an illiterate 16-year-old who arrived in New York in 1885, speaking no English. His name was Friedrich Trump. Yes, grandfather to Donald. So, in the 19th century, this was the era of the Great Migration, 1/4 of Europe upped and moved to the United States. With what result? The US replaced Europe at the pinnacle of world wealth and power. So when we're talking about these fears of all these people coming all at once, it happened to be a very good thing for the US in the 19th century. Although maybe if I was a passport control officer, then I might have kept out one particular immigrant in 1885.
Yes. Well, that's what one of the rich facets of this book is how you both uncover histories and present past histories, and also how you project what will happen in the future. So within pages of what we learn about the past, let's say Trump's grandfather, you also have, if you look at 102, you have also, because we are discussing Trump's wall, you say at the bottom of 101 that Aroma Ravi, the director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements and an author of a recent IPCC report, predicted. Can you read that prediction?
In some parts of the world, national borders will become irrelevant. You can set up a wall to contain 10,000 and 20,000 and 1 million people, but not 10 million.
Now, this is the prophetic part. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
The prognosis is not good. Toward the end of this century, if current trends are not reversed, large parts of Bangladesh, the Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, and Vietnam, among other countries, will be underwater, says Michael Gerard, director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change at Columbia Law School. Some island nations, such as Kiribati and the Marshall Islands, will be close to disappearing entirely. Swaths of Africa from Sierra Leone to Ethiopia will be turning into desert. Glaciers in the Himalayas and the Andes, on which entire regions depend on drinking water, will be melting away. So basically, we're going to have about 1 billion people who will need to leave home by the middle of the century. Where are they going to go? So in terms of migration, today there are 250 million people, including you and me, who live in a country other than the one that we were born in. By the middle of the century, there'll be another 1 billion people who'll have to leave. Where are they going to go? And the question I ask is, who caused them to go? Why are they going? So we Americans are 4% of the global population, but we put 1/4 of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. The Europeans, we put 1/3 of the excess carbon, and the Europeans another 1/4. So they're coming here because we were not only in their countries, but in the atmosphere above their countries.
Very nice. And the trajectory of the book is partly saying not only that this is inevitable, that more people will come, but a very strong argument that you're presenting over and over again is that it is good that people come, that there are always only good consequences, or largely or mainly good consequences of migration. And what's fascinating is that you do this in different contexts, but there's one that I just wanted you to talk about more formally. This is on page 190, my friend. What you're doing there is you have mentioned on page 189 that in 2015, the US Department of Citizenship and Immigration Services asked the National Academy of Sciences to undertake this massive study of what are the consequences of immigration. I thought it's fascinating. Can you sum that up? And I would also like, if you don't mind, on page 190, where it starts, the study found that in almost all categories. I think that needs to be read out, the next 2-3 paragraphs, if you don't mind. So just sum it up for us,
Sure.
and then we can, yeah.
So in this section of the book, look, the economic arguments for immigration are pretty much, almost every single serious economist agrees that migration is a good thing. There's one man, George Borjas at Harvard, which every time people quote economic studies that immigration is not a good thing, they quote this one guy. It's like climate. There's 99% of the scientists agree that humans caused global warming and one don't, but the 1% get a lot of publicity. But there's another argument that the immigration restrictionists make about migrants, which is that today's migrants don't become American or don't assimilate like previous generations do. Oh, my grandmother, when she came here, she had to learn English, but now look at these Mexicans, they come here and they don't even learn English. Okay, so a lot of people on both sides throw around facts and figures out of their own hats. What was needed was an authoritative, thoroughly researched study conducted by a respected, impartial organization. In 2015, the federal government, the US Department of Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the National Science Foundation asked the National Academy of Sciences to undertake just such a study. That is, are immigrants assimilating? It was and remains the definitive word on the subject. And by the way, George Borjas, the economist I just mentioned, was part of the experts on this study, so no one can claim it was biased. The 500-page report looked at 41 million immigrants and their 37 million children. English language learning, quote, is happening as rapidly or faster now than it did for earlier waves of mainly European immigrants in the 20th century, the report found. The study found that in almost all categories, immigrants do better than the native born. Quote, foreign-born immigrants have better infant, child, and adult health outcomes than the US-born population in general, and better outcomes than US-born members of their ethnic group. In comparison with native-born Americans, the foreign-born are less likely to die from cardiovascular disease and all cancers combined. They experience fewer chronic health conditions, lower infant mortality rates, lower rates of obesity, and immigrants also have a lower prevalence of depression and of alcohol abuse, and they get divorced less. However, by the third generation, immigrants assimilated into America in all ways.
This I must say, I must interrupt, Suketu. This is the golden paragraph, because like a wonderful man, you're waving the flag then of how you belong in America right there. Right. You're describing a national identity.
So by the third generation, their crime, health, divorce, and education rates are the same as the native born. They sit around on the couch and watch TV and grow obese, work or don't work, study or don't study, commit crimes, and dislike learning languages other than English at the same rates as the native born. In other words, they've become fully American. But it takes 3 generations to get there. The first generation that comes there actually outperforms in every way. It assimilates faster than earlier generations. But our grandkids, they're Americans.
That's very funny. Another feature of a manifesto is, over and over again, you deliver these very lucid lines that establish the reality you're trying to present. And one of my favorites is on page 176, where you say, diversity isn't just a nice thing to have. It is actively essential to attract the kind of people who create wealth. Right? So it's not just a sort of a liberal impulse, some sort of a feel-good multiculturalism. You're actually saying that it has concrete motivations in the economy and for the idea of cultural growth. And of course, you also mentioned in another chapter population growth. Immigrants are necessary in all these aspects. Can you talk a little bit about that? And if you could let the conversation also veer towards the example you give of this town in upstate New York, Schenectady, how a revitalization of a depressed economy took place because of migrants.
Sure. So look, the creative class that is making our cities boom, the people who create wealth, they're well traveled. They don't want to live in a unicultural environment, even if they've grown up in a small town somewhere or a suburb where everyone looks like them. They come to the cities, and after they work all day in the bank or the tech companies, they don't want to eat surf and turf. They want a choice of pupusas or parathas for dinner. They want music that comes from all over the world. They actively like people that uh, don't look like them, speak a different language. So this kind of diversity um, is something that is essential in, well, luring business. When Amazon was going to set up a headquarters in Queens, although it didn't materialize, one of the reasons that Amazon cited for choosing Queens was its diversity. They wanted their workforce to benefit from, when you get a whole bunch of highly qualified people somewhere, you have to figure out something for them to do when they leave the office. Otherwise, they won't work there. They've got a choice of places all over the world. So one of the arguments that I make is that this kind of diversity is necessary for big cities, but also for small cities. For the example you gave of Schenectady. Now, people claim, oh, America's too full. We can't allow in all these people now. Until Trump came along, the US gave out about 1 million green cards a year, and then it slowed significantly. But, people say, oh, we can't let in these people because we don't have space. This is, the scientific term is bullshit. The US is a huge empty country. The vast majority of the population is clustered along the coast. And there are cities all over the country which are dying out from lack of people, such as Detroit and Baltimore. Now, Schenectady used to be one such city. Schenectady in upstate New York was this mill town. General Electric came from there. There were all these factories. But then in the 70s, 80s, it started dying out. And it needed people. So one day, the Polish Republican mayor of Schenectady, in the 1990s, Albert Jarzynski, he was taking a walk and he came across a brown-skinned man building a Hindu temple. And he goes up to the guy and says, oh, where you from? You're from India? He says, no, I'm from Guyana. And the mayor didn't know where that was from. And the mayor said, well, Guyana, it's a country in South America, and there's a lot of people like Hindus, Muslims, there's Christians. And the mayor said, oh, but that's very nice. You chose to live here. Can we give you some of the town funds? Can we give you some money? And the Guyanese man said, I don't believe in public assistance. And the Republican mayor said, you're singing my tune. Where can I find more of you? So the guy says, well, if you want to meet some Guyanese, you got to come down to Richmond Hill in Queens. So the mayor started taking trips to Richmond Hill. He'd go down from Schenectady, and he would address community meetings in Richmond Hill, which is lots of Guyanese and Trinidadians and other West Indians, and say, oh, ye Guyanese, come up to the promised land, Schenectady. We will find you a mortgage. We will, get you a house for cheap. groceries are cheap there. It's a place to raise your kids. And when they came there, he would personally take visiting Guyanese around for tours of Schenectady, and then take them to his mother-in-law's house for homemade Polish wine, in spite of the wine they came. And today, there are 10,000 Guyanese in Schenectady, at least 10,000. There's probably more now. There's Guyanese National Day, there's a cricket league, there's little shops, there's little restaurants. So it's not that Schenectady is a boom town, but the towns all across America, like Utica, another town in upstate New York, which is full of Bosnians. There are towns in rural Maine, which is really losing people at an alarming rate, which is now full of Somalis. So there are intelligent ways to manage immigrant flows, even large numbers of them. Um, Last year, a group of American mayors made a very intelligent proposal for what are called heartland visas, which is if you're coming in from another country and you're a refugee or an economic migrant or whatever, then as long as you stay in a depopulated part of the country, um, in Detroit, it costs $50,000 to demolish an abandoned house, but you can sell the same house for $1 to a migrant who'll happily live in it and refurbish it. And the idea is that if they stay there for a few years, then they get a green card and they can live anywhere else in the country. Canada, by the way, has such a proposal, a program actually. The province of Saskatchewan, for example, they're called provincial visas. If you stay in frozen Saskatchewan for 3 years, then basically you get a white card to live anywhere else in Canada after that. So as a result, there's 50,000 Pakistanis shivering in Saskatchewan. Canada's a big cold country and it needs warm bodies, and it's actually increasing the number of immigrants that it's taking in threefold in the near future.
Yes. And what you've been saying so far, one of the lines that I liked, which underlines that, is the immigrant armada that is coming to your shores is actually a rescue fleet. So you're saying to countries where the population rate is growing down, where the economy is suffering, that actually immigration is going to revitalize this and is going to produce inventive new identities and newness, and new vitality will come in. Also, a part of this book, which some folks might find provocative, I did, and I liked it for that reason, is a chapter towards the end called Immigration as Reparations. So, Suketu, that's on page 208, 209, where you open the discussion. And you say, if the rich countries don't want the poor countries to migrate, and we have to remember, of course, if we have read the rest of the book, that the rich countries have often grown rich on the backs of these poor countries. You say, if the rich countries don't want the poor countries to migrate, there's another solution. Pay them what they're owed. Yeah? Pay the costs of colonialism, of the wars they imposed of them, of the inequality they have built into the world order, and the bill they owe for the carbon they have put into the atmosphere. Had you read, no, let me put it differently. Had you ever encountered this argument, which to me seems utterly justifiable, in your own education? Like, I mean, what were the sources of inspiration for this polemic that you have unleashed?
So, what I set out to prove in my book is that people are moving not because they hate their homes or their families or their culture. They're moving because they have no choice, because the rich countries stole the future of the poor countries through colonialism, then what replaced colonialism, which is corporate colonialism, war, and climate change. People aren't leaving to see the lights of Broadway or the Eiffel Tower. They're moving because they have no choice. And so devote a great deal of the book to setting out the arguments and proving um, uh, the ways in which the West has impoverished the rest of the planet. For example, when the British came to India, um, uh, India's share of world GDP was about 25%, so a quarter of all the world's economic output when the British first came to India came from India. By the time the British left, some 200 years later in 1947, India's share of world GDP was under 4%. Where did that money go? To England. So when I walk around London, I feel I should have a room in those museums, those palaces. Um, you know, in Latin America, it's the same. People say, "Oh, the U.S. wasn't a colonizer; we were a colony ourselves." At one point, 42% of all the land in Guatemala was owned by not America, but one American corporation, the United Fruit Company. So much of Latin America was run by American corporations as a plantation for their own benefit. So when these people are coming, they're following the money, their money. So when it got me thinking about what's a fair way to redress this. And the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates happens to be my colleague at NYU Journalism. And when his book came out, it was kind of an earthquake. And he made this very strong and very well-argued case for reparations that are owed to African Americans for slavery. And I think there's a larger bill around the planet that is owed that, for example, Belgium owes Congo, or France owes Algeria, or Britain owes Nigeria. And how should that bill be paid? Well, for a long time, the reparations went the other way. Haiti had the voluntary declare independence from France in the early 19th century. It was the first country in the Americas to declare independence like this in the Caribbean. And for this, France demanded reparations, which Haiti kept paying until the 1960s. So imagine this, one of the poorest countries in the world, paying one of the richest countries, paying them. I now submit that France should be paying Haiti reparations. And how should they pay them? By letting them in.
Yes.
By letting Haitians into France, not to invade, but to work.
That's right. Could you read actually that paragraph on page 209? Do you mind, on page 209, the paragraph that begins, "Migration today is a form of reparations"? Can you read that paragraph?
The countries that are paying aren't necessarily the ones that are directly linked with the people they are absorbing. The vast majority of migrants move from a poor to a less poor country, not a rich one. So for example, I believe 1/3 of Lebanon now is Syrians. Fair immigration quotas should be based on how much the host country has ruined other countries. Thus, Britain should have quotas for Indians and Nigerians, France for Malians and Tunisians, Belgium for very large numbers of Congolese. The Dominican Republic, where the US propped up the homicidal dictator Trujillo for 3 decades, should be high on the American preference list. So I'm making an argument for immigration quotas, not based on whether people are skilled or unskilled, but how much the host country has screwed up the countries that they're coming from.
Yes, yes. In a little while, Nadine will come with some questions that have been posted. So we have a few more minutes before that. So I wanted to have you read out a little bit or discuss our own identities as Indians. And there's a passage. First of all, early in the book, you mention Paul Ehrlich, who in the population bomb, after a visit to Delhi, advocated that Indian males should be sterilized. And keeping that in mind, I then came to page 206, where you speak about what Indians have given to the US. This is at the bottom of that page. And so last year, India sent more immigrants to the United States than any other country on the planet. And then could you read that paragraph that follows?
Indian Americans are the most successful group of any kind in the United States. We have the highest per capita incomes, the highest educational attainment, and the lowest crime rate. 77% of us over the age of 25 have a college degree, which is 2.5 times the American average. More than half have a postgraduate degree. We are 8% of America's doctors. Around a fifth of all startups in Silicon Valley were founded by Indians. As a minority, we are the model. But it's not because Indians are some sort of master race. If that were the case, what explains India? America skims off the quote creamy layer, as we used to call the elite of the lower castes in India from other nations. Most of the immigrants who come here are substantially better educated and richer than the countrymen they left behind. We do not come empty-handed, mine host.
Yes. I wanted you to read this simply because I wanted those who have believed, like Paul Ehrlich, that the Indian males should be sterilized, that we would not have reaped this rich harvest if that indeed had been on the agenda. Should
Well,
we? Yeah.
The whole immigration debate there's some curious alliances. So many of the most racist anti-immigrant thinkers and policymakers were people in the environmental and the pro-choice movement. Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, John Muir. These were people who wanted America to be pristine white. And actually, the most notorious writer against American immigration was a Michigan ophthalmologist who founded Numbers USA and FAIR and all these organizations. And basically, he was also a member of Planned Parenthood and the Sierra Club. So these were people who thought that the country has too many people, and if we let in any more, then it'll ruin the environment. And they were also making the argument for abortion based on stopping it from having children, on eugenics. Yeah.
Yes. I'm wondering if Nadine wants to come in with the questions, because now we have reached 42. Oh, yeah.
I would love to. Thank you so much, you two, for what one of our viewers calls a compelling conversation, and I certainly couldn't agree more. There are quite a few questions, so we'll try to get as many as we can in the time we have left. So let's see, let's start with, this is, I think, a good one. How can the narrative of exceptionalism in diversity confront the divide created between brown immigrants from South Asia, labeled model minorities, and Blacks, you see them as often disconnected from this country's long history of slavery and racism?
That's an excellent question, and it's something that we come up with again and again. The idea that these new waves of skilled immigrants come in, and suddenly they seem to be doing so well, and often they don't have state assistance. And it's also an argument used by people in these newer groups. There are lots of Indians who say, look, we came here and we're doing so well. Well, what about the Blacks? They must be lazy, or there's something wrong in their culture. This is actually an argument made by Amy Chua in this utterly racist book she wrote along with her husband, Jed Rubenfeld, which I attacked in a long article in Time magazine. The article that there are some model minorities who are culturally superior, and so are that we should have quotas for those minorities, people who come from those cultures as opposed to others. The simple fact is that slavery has consequences. People were brought here in chains, and the enormous crime that was perpetrated on the original sin of the founding of this country has long-lasting consequences to this day, as Nancy quotes as so well documented. And so it's much easier for an Indian to walk into an office and get a job interview than it is for an African American, and this remains so even today. So I think we new immigrants have a special obligation to learn about the history of things like slavery and acknowledge that the gains that we enjoy, such as affirmative action, were actually they were built on the backs of African Americans and the civil rights struggle. And I don't think that we acknowledge that enough in our writing or in the politics that we pursue.
Great. So there's a question that's along the same lines from a viewer. Could you please talk a bit about the downside of the perception of model minorities of South Asian descent? There are many of us who are neither successful in their chosen profession, nor are we leaving any meaningful mark on society.
So I once, when I was volunteering for the Coalition for the Homeless in New York, came across a group of Sikh immigrants from India, and they were all alcoholics living on the street, and they were all trying to get each other to go to the Gurudwara, the Sikh temple, to promise not to touch another drop. And they were living on the streets. They had no jobs. They depended on handouts from the government or NGOs, but they don't figure into the official statistics about our community. And there's lots of people like that, not just people who are homeless, but people who aren't as successful. And it's actually, and this is again where Amy Chua's malign influence comes in, the tiger mom, the idea that if your kids aren't scoring straight A's, you should beat them until they do. This afflicts just about every Asian kid that I know who's growing up in the country, and these expectations that academically, at least, they'll go to Harvard, and if they go to a state school, then they failed somehow. But it is a stereotype that we're constantly struggling against.
This is a question to current state of this country. Given our new VP and the number of Indian Americans who are in the Biden-Harris administration, do you anticipate that there will be some sort of backlash?
So I'm speaking to you right now from North Carolina, and I have a writing retreat in a lovely little town called Pittsboro in Chatham County, North Carolina. And it's been really interesting getting to know my neighbors. There's 2 giant Confederate flags in this town. There's also 15 yoga studios. And soon, coming up down the road, is going to be a Hindu temple with a statue of an Indian god Murugan, which is going to be taller than the Statue of Liberty, looming over the North Carolina dairy fields. So it's a really interesting place to gather these stories, because it's the Old South and the New South. And as Indians, we're like the Japanese were in South Africa, with the acceptable other. Most people around here know of an Indian doctor, or they might have gone to a motel where they know the friendly local Indian motel owner. We tend to have a good reputation, but as we become more publicly visible in politics, there is a backlash. But here I must tell the story of my brother-in-law, a man named Jay Chowdhury, who in 2016 called me in New York, and he said he wanted to run for state senate in North Carolina. He lives in Raleigh. And I was a little doubtful, a brown man running in a district that's 90% white. And it was his first time running for office. But he and his campaign knocked on some 40,000 doors, and he ran against a white opponent in an almost entirely white district, and he won in a landslide. And he's now the Democratic whip in the state Senate. And it showed me, because I went campaigning for him, that all politics is local, all politics is personal. He introduced himself to people who might not have voted for him otherwise, and he's doing a fantastic job, and he's accepted in this in a state that can be quite Republican. So my book begins in rage but ends in hope, and it ends with the story of Jay's election to the state Senate in North Carolina.
That's great. This is, the viewer says it's just one question, but there's actually three. And this might be something that both of you might want to answer or address. At some point in your life, have you ever had a feeling of hatred towards the natives or the white community? If you did, how did you overcome it? If you didn't, how do you forgive xenophobic people?
Go ahead, Suketu.
Well, certainly when I was in this horrific high school, I felt rage. And, I really struggled to understand why people would hate me, what it was about my background. I thought I was a personable guy, and why were all these people hell-bent on attacking me? And I remember in my junior year, there was another minority who joined the school. Hey, Mehta, there's not a Hindu in school. And it turned out to be not a Hindu, but a Jain, my friend Ashish, who is still one of my best friends. And we were walking down the halls of the school in 1980, which was the time of the Iranian hostage crisis. And this kid, he comes down and he glares at us and says, "Fucking Ayatollahs." And I said, hey, we ain't Iranians, we're Indians. And he thinks for a second and says, "Fucking Gandhis." So then I realized that the hate wasn't personal. It was just that we were other. We could have been Iranians or Indians, and I was impressed that he could associate the right historical personage with the country. So I found it really difficult to hate because it was so free-flowing, and I realized in the end it wasn't personal. It's just what they had been taught at the dinner table by their parents. It was based on fear, and in the Trump era, it became really difficult to deal with the what Trump himself said and what the Republicans said, because these were people who ought to have known better. Many of them had gone to the finest schools and were still coming out and spouting this kind of hate. That I found unforgivable.
Yeah. We have time for two more questions, I think. So Mark is wondering if you might please contrast your process of writing this book and writing Maximum City.
So Maximum City consumed my life for 7 years. It's a book about Bombay. The first draft of the manuscript was 1,667 pages, and my editor, the late great Suketu Mehta at Knopf, stopped speaking to me for 9 months after he got the manuscript. It's primarily a book of reportage. This one took about a year and a half, 2 years, because it was born out of necessity and rage, the staggering hypocrisy of the global conversation around migration, which sees immigrants rapists, murderers. And it's primarily a polemic. It's an argument. It's evidence-based anger. I have 50 pages of footnotes. So anyone who wants to see where the figures that I come up with, the economic arguments for migration or the figures, they can go to the exact study or article that I quote. And I tell you, but both of these books have this one thing in common, which is the focus on the individual human being at the foot of history, personal and political. And I'll tell you this one story from my new book, which is about this, which is also, it's reporting, it's not polemics. And it's set in a place called Friendship Park on the US-Mexico border. Friendship Park was set up under the Nixon administration as a place where if you are on this side of the border and you don't have papers or you only have a work permit and you can't go back to visit your country, then your family can come to the other side of the border. It's the only place along the entire 3,000-mile southern border where your family can come up and meet you in person. So under the Nixon administration, there was a little park. Your family could come, you could have a picnic, you could give each other a hug, and then you'd both go back to either side of the border. And then with successive administrations, including the Obama and Clinton administrations, access became more and more limited. Fences got put up and barriers until under the Trump administration, there's a thick, ugly industrial mesh fence. And visitation is limited to 10 minutes at a time on weekends only. So I went and spent 2 weeks in Friendship Park to see what these migrants were, who were being depicted as criminals and robbers and rapists, different from you and me, lacking in family values, right? This was how the Trump and the Republicans depicted migrants. And what I saw there was some of the most heartbreaking reporting of my career. There's this fence, and I saw, for example, a Mexican man who who'd come across a couple of decades earlier, and he had left Mexico because his mother needed hospital treatment, and he couldn't make the money in Mexico. So he came here to work in construction, and every week, almost all of the money that he saved went back to his family in Mexico. This, by the way, is true of migrants worldwide. Remittances are 4 times all the foreign aid on the planet. So the best way of helping poor people on the planet is to let people come here and let them send back money. So this Mexican man goes back. His mom is coming up to meet him after 17 years. And he hasn't seen her at all in those 17 years. He goes up to the fence. Mom comes up, and he told me later, through the fence, through the holes in the mesh, he could feel her breath on his face. And she said, "I miss you, my son." And he said, "I love you, Mom." And she said, "You look too thin. Are you eating enough?" It doesn't look like you're eating enough. The universal question posed by all moms. And finally, they couldn't give each other a hug, but the holes in the fence were large enough only to put their pinky fingers through. So he puts his pinky finger through, Mom puts her pinky finger through, and then finally they do this thing. They call it the pinky kiss in Friendship Park. All along the fence, their mothers and sons, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, doing this tiniest bit of human contact, the pinky kiss. Anyone who doubts that migrants have family value, anyone who thinks that these immigrants are criminals, robbers, rapists, should go to Friendship Park and see what enormous sacrifices these migrants make for their families. They come here not to take, but to work, to give to their families and to us as Americans.
Thank you for sharing. That was an incredibly moving story. Thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amitabha.
No, I was saying great. That's
okay. Well, are you hopeful for the future?
So, yes, I am. and as the election of my brother-in-law, which I saw at close range, that certainly was a hopeful sign. But also what happened now with the last election. Um, Biden was not my first choice in the Democratic primaries, but now that it's come in, I'm really impressed by what he's doing on a range of fronts, including immigration. I still think he could go further, but so far his programs are promising. The fact that the dreamers, there might be a pathway to citizenship, there might be a pathway to legalization for the 11 million undocumented. This gives me hope that America will return to some sort of sanity. And I contrast it particularly with the country of my birth, India, where there's uh, an administration in power which I dislike as much as the Trump administration, and where there's much less hope of the Modi government being dislodged. So in the US, I see hope, particularly when it comes to immigration. I see that the country is, America by and large is a country of immigrants which wants to continue being a country of immigrants. The last 4 years might have been an aberration, but they could come back 4 years from now. And so I hope that we've sort of been, we have our guard up now much more than we did before 2016. That we realize how quickly these people would come back with their hate and their fear.
True. Yeah. Glimpses of hope, I think might be a good way to close today. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today for this. Again, I think we can probably talk for hours. This is such an important topic, and both of you certainly brought it to life in this conversation. So thank you to both of you. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Please visit nationalartsclub.org for all the other programs we have coming up. And please stay safe, everyone. Thank you. And we'll see you soon, I hope. Have a good night.
Bye. Bye. See you. Thank you, Suketu. Bye. Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you.